Hi everyone, in this video of Excited Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at another chess endgame, and this is pawn endgames, and specifically about triangulation. Now, what is triangulation? Triangulation refers to a king maneuver which aims to lose a tempo and leave the opponent with the move. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, let's use this position as a reference. We see here that it's actually white to move, and white wants to advance the pawns. And if it was black to move, black would have to go back, and then white can come forward with the king, and essentially white is going to win the game. However, it is actually white to move, and if white tries to play the move c6 check here, and try to break through the position, then unfortunately, black is able to hold it all together. Black can actually go king to c8, and this is the way you draw. You don't go b takes c6 check. This actually loses the game. Because after king c5, how does black hold the position to a draw? There's no way. Because king d8, or king c8, it'll just transpose. King d6. Now, you must go king c8, because if you go to e8, then b7. So king c8, you take the pawn on c6, king b8 and b7. You move the king out, and then king c7, you queen the pawn as white. Simple. Now, after c6 check, let's look at that same variation, but you go king c8. Now, after king c8, white is obviously going to have to try marching forward with king d6. However, after king to b8, this is already a draw. You can tell because if you go c7 check, black can go king c8, and regardless of where white moves the king, it's going to be stalemate. And if you take the pawn on b7, black will just capture the pawn on b7, mainly because it's the only legal move, but also because white has no way of actually winning the game after that. So white tries to make progress with king d7. However, after king d7, the position is completely drawn. B takes c6. Black eliminates one of the two passed pawns, and now if you capture the pawn on c6 with king takes c6, then just simply king c8, and black has gained the opposition. If you haven't seen my opposition video, I recommend that you do check it out. So after king c8, it's just a simple draw for black, and white has managed to get nothing done. Now, c6 check may not work. But what about this position arising where it's black to move? And that's what white's goal is going to be. King to e5. White is going to try wasting a tempo so that this same position occurs where it is black to move. Because if black goes back, the king comes forward. That's basically it, and it's completely lost for black in that case. So king e5, trying to waste some time, but for a good reason. Now, after king e5, where does black go? Black has a couple of choices on c8, d8, e8, e7, and also c6. So there's a 20% chance on each of those squares. What happens if you go king to e7, you might be asking? If you go there, then just c6, and you cannot stop the pawn in time. If you go king back to d8, you lose the pawn on b7 and the pawn queens. And if you take the pawn on c6, b7, and you're definitely not in the square of the pawn. So c6 would be winning there. Now, what about king c6? That's what is the best move, and we'll get to that in a second. If king c8, king d8, or even king to e8, you bring the king forward. Depending on where the king goes, let's say to d8, you go forward to d6. And now if the king goes to c8, you go to e7. You slowly but surely take away the king's squares. King here, now king to d7. King to a8. And here, white can actually go for c6. And if you take the pawn with bc6, king c8, you have no way of stopping this pawn from queening. So king d8 doesn't work, and neither does king e8 or king c8. They basically lead to similar variations. Now, after king e5, king c6. And after king c6, white goes king d4. Why? Because now if you go king back to d7, just king d5, and the position is the same. However, there's one difference, and that is it is black to move, not white. And basically, white is winning here. Black has to go back, and you bring the king forward. Now, you cannot go to b5, because just king to d5 nonetheless. And it doesn't matter what you do, the king just infiltrates to d6 and then to c7, and you can't stop it at all. So basically, the idea is to waste a move, and then you simply can advance the king with king e6, king d8, king d6, king e7, king gets in, and after c6, black is completely lost, since there is no way to stop this pawn or this pawn from queening, and black is completely lost here. Let's look at a couple more examples of the triangulation technique. In this next position, we see that white is up a pawn. But how does white actually convert this advantage? Well, let's look at this. But before we look at how to do this technique, let's look at the corresponding squares, which I will go over in a separate video. The corresponding squares are basically squares of reciprocal zugzwang, meaning that if one side is on one of the corresponding squares, depending on whose turn it is to move, they are in zugzwang. So, in this case, we can highlight the squares as being d6 and d8, and then there's also c7 and c5, and finally, there's also c8 and d5. These are essentially all of the corresponding squares. So, basically, whoever's turn it is to move, it's zugzwang. In this case, it's actually white's turn to move. However, white is actually up a pawn. So white has a chance of winning this game. How does white do so? Well, let's see. White goes king c4. Now, king c4 is one way to win, but we also have another way, which is actually just to go back to d4. And we'll go side by side and see the variations at the same time. King c4. If king c4 is played, then obviously black is going to try not to go to c7, because then you go forward with king c5. And if black goes king b8, white's going to go king d4, and is going to infiltrate in this way, by simply going to d5, and then later on to d6 if black doesn't do anything. So king b8 is not going to be working here, so that's why after king c4, black goes king d8. And now white plays the move king d4. They're going to constantly repeat moves until at one point black is not able to take it. King c8, and now you go king d5. And here king to d8 is played. Why do you go king to d8? Because if you go king to c7, then there's king c5. The king gets into b6, and white is completely winning here. Now, with that being said, after king to d5 is played, black actually goes king to d8 here. And white advances the king over to d6. And after king c8, c7. And after c7, white is unstoppable because the pawn is going to promote. Basically, black is completely lost here. And the other thing I wanted to see is that after king d4, it leads to a similar idea, except the kings are basically shuffled between the c4 and d4 square. The idea is the same. The concept is completely the same. It's just that the order of the moves is a bit different. So king d8, you go king c4, king c8, and now you go king d5. King d8, and then basically the same idea. If you go to c7, king c5, and the king gets into b6. And if you go to d8, then king to d6, king c8, and then c7. Basically, you want to get this very position where it is black to move, and black will mess up, essentially. Since these two squares are corresponding squares, meaning that they have reciprocal zugzwang. Meaning that if this king were to move to c7 or to d8, then black is the first one to break this tension, meaning that black is the one who essentially gave up the game like that. Now, after this whole process, it's black to move. And basically the king just triangulated around this position and just came back to that same position where instead of it being white to move, it's black to move now. And black is in a lot of trouble now and is not able to defend. So now let's look at a couple of games where this was actually used in. In this next position of triangulation, we see that white is actually better. They're up a pawn, and it turns out that the pawn break actually doesn't work in white's favor. And that's because there's more attackers than defenders of the g5 square. So, you can't go g5 just like that. So what do you do here if you're playing with the white pieces? Well, you have actually three options. You can go king d4, king f4, and king f3. Basically, you want to reach this position, but it's black to move, because black will have to either go to d7, in which case you go to d5 and you come closer and closer to the pawns, or black goes to c6, and then you can go king f4, push the pawn, and basically there's no way of black stopping you. Or if black goes to e7, you simply go to d5, you bring your king closer, and eventually you go h5. It's going to be zugzwang for black, and they have to waste a tempo, you bring your king further, and it's a pretty similar thing if they go to c7. So after this king to d4 move, and by the way, we can also look at king to f4 a bit later, if king to d4, then black will go king c6. King c4, white tries to maintain the opposition. g5 here does not actually work because you have no breakthrough after this. You have hg5, hg5. You might seem to be able to bring the king a bit closer into the position, or you may seem to be able to do this, but it's really not the case. After king d7, f7, you would just catch the pawn, but at the same time, if you try to bring your king in, then this pawn can always be used to deflect the king. King would have to go over here, and after g3, you simply take, but after king e6, there's no way to defend this pawn, and it's a complete draw here. So g5 doesn't work. King c4 instead. Now, after king d6, it's a very risky decision to make, but white must go for king to b5. I say this is risky because you're bringing your king farther and farther away from your pawns, because there are chances that black may actually be able to round up your pawns and simply win like that. But it's a bit of a risk to take. After king to d5, this is the move that should be played, because if you go king to e5, then king c6. You bring the king closer this way. And now if you go h5, then gh5, and after king f5, king d5 is winning. So you must go king to f4. And after king f4, you go king to d6. You're not going to be worrying about this g4 pawn. Since you bring your king to e6, you're going to capture this f6 pawn, and if anyone's going to queen first, it's going to be white. So you're not worried about any of this. So black will go king to d5, trying to get opposition. King b6, king d6, king d7. The kings battle it out until here, white plays the move h5. Very nice. And why is this nice? Because after h5, you're forcing black to move the king to either d6, d8, e7, or e8. And basically, in any of those squares, white's king is able to advance a little bit to the right side of the board. King d6 is best, but now king c8, king e5, king d7, king f4, and king e6. And this is a loss for black. If you capture the g4 pawn, white takes on f6, and it doesn't matter if you capture h5, this pawn on f5 is closer to queening than this pawn on h6. If you try defending, then white will just wear your king's position out. You can go king f7, you could even go king to e7. In either case, this pawn on f6 is going to be targeted next, and after, say, king g4, you lose f6, and you're simply going to lose the game. So, that was the reasoning behind king d4. Now, you can also try king to f4, and that's because after king to e7, since bringing the king over to d5 would only help white advance the pawn over to g5, king e7. Black needs to help the defense of this pawn queening by bringing the king a bit closer. Now if g5 is played, black can trade all of the pawns off and go king f7. And essentially, black can stop the pawn from queening, and this is just a draw. So, king f3 was played here. Now comes king d7. And after king d7, white goes king to e3. Why do you go king to e3? Because if you go king to e4, then just king to d6, and the position somewhat repeats. So you go king to e3, king d6, since if king e7, you bring the king out to f4, and if king f7, king e4. And you battle it out this way. King d5, king d7, and white also has this extra tempi of h5, which is able to obviously force it to be black's move, And after black plays king e7, king c7, any move with the king, the white king advances closer to black's territory. So king to e7 doesn't work. King d6, on the other hand, if this was played, would allow king to e4, king c6, king f4, king d6, and white still advances g5. And basically the idea is that if you take, it doesn't matter what black does after this, they're hopeless. King e7, you don't push the pawn, you go king to g6. King e8 would run into king g7, and if king f8, you simply are able to queen here as white, and there's no trouble here. So let's look at one more example of triangulation. In this final position of triangulation, we see that white actually plays the move king to f2. Now after this move, white actually offered their opponent a draw. However, black accepted, but it turns out this position isn't actually a draw. Black goes king to e4 if this was actually played in the game. King to e2, and now f4. And after king to f2 and f3, this position was indeed a draw in the endgame books. However, it's actually a win. And this is because after king to f1, you're not going to go king to e3 here as black, because going king to e3 would indeed make it a draw after king e1 and then f2 check, king goes back, and then you simply have to give the pawn up. So, what does black play then? You might be thinking. Well, let's draw those corresponding squares again. We see these squares are corresponding. We see that these squares are corresponding. And we also see that these squares are corresponding. So we need to make it white's move here. And if it's white's move, it doesn't matter where the king moves to. It's going to be a loss for white. So black is going to triangulate with the king. And let's see how. King to f5. And now, if the king goes to g1, then you simply play king to e5. And then after king goes to f1, you go king to e4. And basically, it's just triangulation and a win. If you go king to f2, however, then just king to f4. You bring the king closer. And it doesn't matter if you're going to queen this pawn. You're mainly just going to try either winning this pawn or bringing the pawn as close as possible to queening. In either case, black is winning and white has no way to combat that. So king g1 doesn't work. And neither does king e1, which we're going to look at in a second. And if you go king to f2, that's no better, because after king to f4, black has gained the opposition. And remember how I said that those two squares were corresponding squares? Well, now black makes advantage of this and is either going to bring the king out to g3, capture the pawn and win, or they're just going to advance the pawn and still a win. In either case, white has no way to prevent a loss. So, king f2, king g1, both of them fail. What about king to e1? Well, you go king e5 here, and it's basically the same idea. If you go king to d2, or king to d1, king gets into f4. And basically, there's no way to stop the king from getting to g3. If the king goes to f2, king to f4 nonetheless. And if the king goes to f1, we reach this exact same position we saw previously. However, instead of it being black to move, it's now white to move. And it doesn't matter where white moves, f2, e1, g1, all of those moves lose white the game. And we already covered how. So basically, after this, white is completely lost and has nothing to do here. So it's very ironic how after this king to f2 move, white offered a draw, and black actually accepted, not knowing that there was actually a win in this position. So I hope I made the topic of triangulation a lot more clear, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.